Well, thank you, Hamid, for the generous introduction. Thank you. Inviting me. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you to all of you for being here. We're in a time period. What happened to the map?
Just coming on. That's no.
Okay. Anyway, so we are in the midst of a very historic era when it comes to Eurasia. There's just so much happening, and it's hard to keep track of it. That's why I'm to speak a bit intelligently. It's obvious, by looking at a map that, what one is referring to, say that Eurasia is going through a historic period. On both ends of the supercontinent, we have both of the U.S. principal adversaries, Russia and China, undergoing historic transformation. What do I mean by that? Well, in the case of Russia, it's very obvious. The war in Ukraine has not gone the way that the Kremlin has wanted in the beginning. They've seemed to have sort of regained the initiative in the last several months. We'll see what happens. We can talk about, how it will be dealt with by the incoming Trump administration. But it's suffice to say that the Russian state is undergoing massive transformation, partly because of the war, partly because of the sanctions, partly because the regime is now roughly about 24 years old. The best days of President Putin are way behind him, and no one lives forever. You could live forever, but you may not be able to rule forever. A lot of things can happen. But we are looking at not just a change of guard in coming years, but also a change of regime. Because keep in mind that following the implosion of the Soviet Union, you have like that 10-year period of chaos in what emerged as the Russian Federation. And it was Putin who came and sort of stabilized the situation for what was formerly known as the Soviet Union and then became the Russian Federation. That regime, that order, that political order is synonymous with the personality. It's one with the personality of the person of President Putin. How will all that change is anybody's guess, but it's reasonable to assume that once a man who's been at the helm for 24 years leaves, there will be changes. And why there will be changes is also driven by the geopolitical environment on that end of, or let's just say, the broader former Soviet space or the Russian Federation's near abroad. You have the Ukraine war has implications and consequences that we haven't seen unfold yet. One small part of it is what we saw between 2020 and 2023 in the South Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And it's my belief that the Turks saw an opening and they took it. Basically, what they did is they saw that the situation in Ukraine is going south. The Russians and their focused, obsessed with Ukraine. They hadn't moved on Ukraine back in 2020, but that was their primary focus. They were distracted from other areas, and they supplied their allies in Baku with military and intelligence assistance, both hardware and humanware. And that resulted in Azerbaijan retaking the Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia after a period of 28 years. Did Moscow want that to happen? No, but it did happen. And that shows that it's sort of this, if you will, receding footprint of Moscow. After the war, it is no secret that the Armenians have accused openly the Russians of abandoning them. In fact, Minister Nicole Pashinyan, has openly said that, if they're worried about Ukraine, how much can they be of help to us? So the idea that Russia is weakening is, something that is resonating within the Russian sphere of influence, the traditional Russian sphere of influence. What we see happening in Georgia, we still need to make sense of it. What is it that is exactly happening? But there's unrest there. There are those who say, we don't want to take on Russia. There are those who say, this is an opportunity, perhaps it won't come again. And we need to be able to assert ourselves. We want to be part of the West, in this case, the European Union. Everybody knows about what's happening in Ukraine. I won't go in there. Though I will add that the situation in Ukraine is somewhat shifting in a tactical sense to the benefit of the Russians. They have created a land bridge from basically Donbass here and Crimea, the areas along the northern coast of the Sea of Azov. That land bridge is crucial because they had territory in eastern Ukraine, Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk, not all of it, and then they had Crimea. This war has allowed them to capture more territory. 23% of Ukraine is now under Russian control. And so that puts them in a really good position. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, having successfully defended themselves in a very remarkable way, are now, as they say, in the language of cricket, on the back foot, on the defensive. They have started to lose villages and small towns. It's not something that's happening with, if you will, rapidity, but it's beginning to happen. And the big question in the debate in Washington is, okay, so when will, this is a debate between Republicans and the Democrats and Republicans as well, that for how long should we continue to arm the Ukrainians in the hope that they will take back lost territories? And are those territories that are lost, for the foreseeable future, are they going to remain in Russian hands? So what's the point of continuing to provide that support? Why not have a negotiated settlement? Obviously, that negotiated settlement is just kicking the can down the road because the Russians need to do the rest and recuperate. And sanctions are not going away, even if there was a ceasefire in Ukraine. And ceasefires are, by definition, one of those things that you violate in due course. Everybody does it. So the idea is that, well, Ukraine also needs to rest and recuperate. The West has to figure things out. There is a disagreement between not just both sides of the Atlantic, especially with the coming of President Donald Trump's administration, but also amongst the Europeans. There is the German position, there is the Polish position. The closer you are to Russia, the more you are concerned about your sovereignty and territorial integrity, the further you are, the luxury you have to do business with the Kremlin and hope that will keep things going. So there are a lot of things to be sorted out. And so the question is that can we prevent further? For those who are arguing that, hey, we need to pause, we need to rethink this. Politically, it's, one of the big problems in the world that we live in is that everything is refracted through politics. It's very hard, if you go by statements of politicians, to figure out what their actual behavior is going to be. So, for example, if Donald Trump says that, if you don't pay up, you being the Europeans, then I will leave you to the Russians to do whatever the hell it is that they want. What does that mean? Does that mean the United States is going to look the other way while the Russians continue to march into Europe? Not really. I don't think any president, including Donald Trump, will allow that. But it makes for good politics, especially in the electoral season, especially if your voter base is that of Donald Trump. So the big question is, what is it at the end of the day that will be the US position? It's safe to say, in my opinion, that the US at least wants a pause, partly because of military reasons. The fear is that if you don't stop right now, forget about taking back territory, you could lose more territory. The Russians could get closer and closer to the Dnieper River and those areas, and then you're really in a very bad position. Ultimately, Ukraine has no permanent solution. By permanent, I don't mean forever, I mean for a reasonable amount of time. Why? Because of geopolitics. If Ukraine is in part of the the Western orbit, then the West is only, so many miles away from Moscow. If Ukraine is in the hands of Russia, then they're on the doorstep of Europe. And people have memories of, all of us have memories of the Eastern Bloc that was allied to the Soviet Union in 1989. So these are not things that can be taken lightly. So there has to be some form of a compromise. That's something that will reshape the future in terms of what the fallout of what's happening with Russia. I already mentioned the South Caucasus. I mentioned Georgia. If let's say the South Caucasus, the three countries here, they, veer off too far away from Russia in the coming years because Russia's economy isn't doing well. Russia still is bogged down in Ukraine. It goes through a leadership transition. Then the big question is, what about the North Caucasus? And the North Caucasus, Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, that entire region has had a history, a very bloody history with the Russians trying to subdue it. And even now, one would argue that Chechnya is under the control of Russia, who essentially, the personality of Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya, before his father came to power, he was assassinated by opponents. This was an open battle space, a very active battle space, something that's very old. It could reignite. So that's a big problem for Russia. The big question here is, and this is something that Russian strategists obsess over, is that the process that led to the implosion of the Soviet Union, is that finally over? Are the borders settled, or can we lose more territory in different parts of our near abroad? That's what bothers them. And Ukraine is probably the most geopolitically significant piece of real estate as far as Moscow is concerned. Let's move into Central Asia, and you see Kazakhstan, you see Uzbekistan, a little bit Kyrgyzstan, not so much Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, but three major countries of the region emerging sort of as in their own right, if you will. What do I mean by that is, if you just look at the flowering of the local languages, where less and less people are now speaking Russian, more people are speaking Kazakh, more people are speaking the Uzbek language, then if you're Russia, you're saying, okay, this isn't good. And meanwhile, while we're focused on our Western flank, the strategic rear is moving into an uncertain direction. So this is also the result of Russia's problem, that it needs to be able to hold on to this space that we call Central Asia. And at the same time, it has to worry, this is a priority. So these are things that are not easily solvable. On top of that, China has been essentially trying to fill the strategic vacuum that is emerging because of the receding Russian footprint. China is not a military power in that sense. It cannot match Russia's military presence in Central Asia, or potential military presence. It's debatable now. And so, but it has a lot of cash that it is dropping and will continue to drop in Central Asia. BRI is just one thing. You have to look at the investments that they are making in every single country in infrastructure and beyond BRI. And you will see that this is a place where China now has a huge advantage. And Chinese, there's a great book by colleague Daniel Markey, who 2020, it's called something like China's Westwards March or something. It's a good book to read. He's at the United States Institute of Peace. He talks about how China is pushing into Eurasia. But the Chinese also have their own problems. So while BRI and the ability to invest money far beyond what Western countries can do is a reality, but China is also facing a huge economic and financial crisis that is we're only beginning to understand it because it's now coming into the mainstream media. There was a time when a few of us used to talk about it, but it wasn't sort of the mainstream view. The dominant paradigm was China rising. Now more and more people amongst the expert community and the journalistic community are questioning that because of the reports about the housing market. And you can see it from Chinese behavior. If you go 2 summers back, when I think it was the first time that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen flew to China. You start from there 2 summers ago, and you come to the present, the recent meeting that Xi had with President Biden, his second year. You can see the diplomatic activity on multiple fronts, political, economic, as well as military. Secretary Lloyd Austin has met with his counterpart in China as well. So why is that happening? It's happening because China realizes it has a problem. The problem is threefold. One is the trade restrictions that are only expected to get far more severe under the Trump administration. Number 2 is the declining investments, or the investments that used to go to China are now looking for other destinations because China is not seen as a place to invest by Western investors. And number 3 is the efforts by Washington and its allies to limit the amount of technology that can be shared with the Chinese. Restrictions on technology transfer. All 3 of these things, combined are creating a problem. So there's a lot of talk about China invading Taiwan. Just speaking with before the talk began, and how there is a disproportionate amount of American and Western focus on the Western Pacific seaboard. We're looking at China through the lens of the maritime states. We're not doing enough work on looking at, because China is not the kind of maritime power that it wants to become, and we fear that it is going to become. It's a land power. If you look at its investments in Central Asia, look at its investments in the China-Pakistan economic corridor in Pakistan, that has its own problems. If you look at the amount of money they invested in Myanmar, which is also failing, then you see that China is a land power and it's understudied. Well, I would encourage any of you who are interested in China or Eurasia to look at that topic. It's something that people don't, very little is discussed, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. There are only a few books, one of them being Daniel Markey's book that I mentioned earlier. So the question is, Russia's footprint is receding. It's not totally gone. Geography and demography matter. So in the case of Kazakhstan, it is the second longest border in the world after the US-Canada border. We're talking 4,750 miles, give or take. That's a long border for any country to have with Russia. then the northern parts of Kazakhstan are where the ethnic Russian minority of Kazakhstan is concentrated. 20% used to be bigger, larger back in the day, but as of now, 20% of all Kazakh nationals are of Russian ethnicity. So you can't just sort of say it's going to disappear, but if you're a Kazakh, you're worried about what is the future of Russia, how that will affect me. Plus, you have this long border with China, roughly about 1,000 miles or so, and China is aggressively pushing in using financial muscle, and you want to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. I was just in Kazakhstan in October at a conference organized by the Kazakh Institute of Strategic Studies, and the conference was on middle powers and the rise of middle powers. It's no secret, the Kazakhs are very open about it. They see themselves as a rising middle power, and they want to have a bigger say in international affairs. They've done quite a bit of work in the past 2 decades toward that end, but they see themselves as, a power unto itself. They are the largest economic power in the region. They obviously don't have a large population, smaller than Uzbekistan, that's double people that Kazakhstan has, but the economy is really far better, and they would like to be able to grow. So in essence, what we have is the strategic environments. You just look at Russia and China, of Central Asia and the South Caucasus, essentially the core, the heart of Eurasia or the heart of Asia. They're in churn, called strategic churn and geopolitical churn, but you also have internal change that is happening, and I'll get to that here in a bit. But I also want to talk about the southern arc of Eurasia that is also changing. And if you look at Turkey, Turkey has aspirations. It already demonstrated its geopolitical aspirations vis-a-vis the South Caucasus with regards to support for Azerbaijan. And you have them trying to develop a trans-Caspian presence by reaching out to the Central Asian states as part of the Organization of Turkic States. So they are aspiring to also have a piece of the action in Central Asia. But Turkey is also going through internal change. This is something that Turkey, as an assertive geopolitical power, is something that has only happened under the current president and when he was prime minister. And now that his popularity is down, his party no longer controls municipalities in Turkey. It is quite likely that his party could lose the next election, and he could lose, the next. He barely got reelected most recently in the most recent election. So Turkey is undergoing change. So how will Turkey behave? Will it continue with the current policy? Will it change? Remains to be seen. Then there is Iran. Iran gets a lot of attention because of its assertiveness in the Middle East, its efforts to dominate at least the northern rim of the Middle East, stretching from the borders of Iran all the way to the Eastern Med, and of course the massive outpost in Yemen on the strategic intersection of the Red and the Arabian Seas. But Iran is also undergoing internal, what I call evolutionary regime change. It's not just the supreme leader. Again, the supreme leader has been at the helm for 35 years. And this is not going to be just another new supreme leader being elected. This is going to be a systemic change. And we can get into that conversation in Q&A. But Iran is internally changing. Iran is also seeing reversals in the Middle East. The Turks have already sort of expanded onto the northern flank of, or part of the northern flank of Iran. And now the Turks are pushing into Syria. If you've been following the news in terms of the revived rebellion in that country. Iran will change, and that will have repercussions for the heart of Asia. Last but not least, you have Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Afghanistan came under the rule of the Taliban 3 years ago. A little over 3 years ago. And so that unfinished business, we don't know where it's going, the emirate. It is trying to be pragmatic. It is, I think about a few days ago, the deputy prime minister of the Taliban regime flew to Tashkent, one of many trips. He's been an ethnic Uzbek. So the Taliban are trying to develop these relations with their neighbors, particularly China, the Central Asian state. They're reaching out to the Russians. The Russians spoke about taking the Taliban, delisting them from their list of international terrorist entities. And there's a lot going on there in that country, but it's far from over. We still have an interim government 3 years later. So what will this new regime look like is remains to be seen. Will they be able to develop a somewhat stable political economy? Another question for which we don't have an answer. And then neighboring Pakistan is in meltdown mode. It's imploding from within. It has 2 rebellions on its borders, on its western flank. Pakistani Taliban rebels up here and Baloch separatists here. That sort of spills over into Iran as well. And there are political problems. The country is close to being insolvent. It's just basically dodging the bullet of default. And then, finally, India is sort of in the reverse direction. India has become the 5th largest economy in the world, most populous nation of the world. And India also wants to play a major role in Eurasia. It sees itself as a competitor to China. It is blocked geographically by Pakistan and from connecting with Afghanistan. Can't do much about that. But recently, if you've been following the news, the Taliban and the Indian government have been starting to negotiate with one another, and they're trying to establish relations. And India doesn't see itself as a Eurasian power. It's trying to be a global player in the alignment with the US vis-a-vis China. And so what you have is a very, very turbulent Eurasia. And this is something that is going to define international affairs in the years to come. Unfortunately, media doesn't talk about it as much because it reacts to developments as opposed to sort of looking at it before things happen. But there's a lot out there that needs to be picked apart by the scholarly community. So I will urge you guys, there's no shortage of topics. So pick one or more and go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, about 30, 40 minutes.
Okay, great.
Questions? So this land power, lots of questions about this. So, of course, the world is focused on maritime. And if you hear foreign policy discussions in Washington, where you live, it's all about the Indo-Pacific. You're suggesting something else, I think. Do you think, given the trajectory of US foreign policy, for example, and it's not just the US, we don't want to just be US centric here, but there is this kind of momentum that like the next administration, every administration tries to pivot to Asia. Obama was the pivot to Asia, what did Biden call it? I don't know. They each have a different term for this. But then you see, some of the people who President Trump was campaigning with, or some of his key foreign policy, particularly China is where our attention should be. These distractions in Eastern Europe or West Asia, huge distractions from the geostrategic threat. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about your thoughts on that, because your talk implies 2 things. Number one is that the maritime issue is less important than people think, and number 2, that implies that a lot of these desired shifts towards Indo-Pacific and China are really misguided?
So that's a great question. I think there's overemphasis on the Indo-Pacific. I think, and it's natural because the United States is the maritime power. That is part of the US toolkit, has been going back to the late 19th century. So when we deal with threats, we tend to sort of go to our familiar toolbox, and then we sort of conceptualize the threat. On top of that, we live in a world of information operations. So let's talk about Taiwan. There's so much, in DC, there's this obsession, or are the Chinese about to take over Taiwan? Will it be 2027? Must be before 2047. Xi said so, so on and so forth. And people like me say, look, wait a minute, just pause here for a second. And Xi has enough problems. I mean, he continued to purge his military and others because he's facing, you don't just purge because you know, it's a normal thing to do. It is a sign of deep problems in the political structure of China. Then, what will you get by taking over Taiwan? Let's assume you can. The estimate is it will take the Chinese about 8 to 9 hours to send their armada for an amphibious landing of Taiwan. Enough time for the United States and its allies to target that armada. And so Xi knows all of this. His strategists know all of this. So are they really going to go after Taiwan? What is their most important thing right now? Their most important thing is to stabilize their economy. Xi is in his unprecedented third term. He's facing pushback from within the CCP and it's the broader PLA ecosystem. These are his issues. He has to make sure that investments keep coming in. If you invade Taiwan, you're going to get more sanctions. And then you've just seen the world's second largest power that has a history of fighting wars completely be, performed so badly in Ukraine. China has not fought a war other than the 1962 war with India. That was on the Himalayas. Again, it's not maritime space. The other thing is, maritime power or any kind of military power is not a function of how many ships you're producing. You could have, whole shipyards producing ships, but if you don't have the human there, you don't have the experience of fighting wars, you have never deployed a multi-divisional force beyond your borders, then it's good luck with anything you do. You need time. And the idea in Washington is China's growing, and therefore we need to up the ante in the Western Pacific. And therefore we say, okay, let's put more money into the Indo-Pacific, let's build more facilities in Northwestern Australia, let's beef up, our presence in the Indian Ocean, let's bring India part of it, and turn Pacific Command into Indo-Pacific Command, build a quad, have relationships with Japan and North Korea, and South Korea, have relations, maintain that robust treaty with the Philippines, develop relations with Indonesia, Australia, and so on and so forth, build that architecture. That's all great, but we're not really assessing where China is pushing into. And the reason why the heart of Asia, Central Asia, the heart of Eurasia is important is because this is a space that fell into the Russian orbit before the founding of the American Republic. So when the United States was founded, and the West was, wasn't doing too well, Europe was fighting with itself. We've seen, well before World War I and II, you had other conflicts that spanned decades, centuries in Europe. So this area has been sort of under or behind it wasn't the Iron Curtain back then, but you go back to the late 1700s, this area fell under the influence of Moscow. We don't have influence there. So that's a big strategic problem. And now that the Russian footprint is, you know, if you will, loosening or receding, China is well placed and China is making those inroads. This is why I'm sure you guys have heard of the middle corridor that supposed to run from Kazakhstan, linking Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan to Trans-Caspian through, you know, now that the bottleneck is seemingly close to being over, I'm talking about the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, you can have a middle corridor that bypasses Russian territory, and it can go to Turkey and to the west. We see the upgrading of upgraded attention that both the Trump, but more so the Biden administration, in terms of engaging with Central Asia. That is just very new. That is just sort of initial steps. We don't really think creatively as to how we can engage with these countries. These countries realize they will always have a relationship with Russia. They will have a relationship with China because of proximity, but they want to diversify. The whole idea behind multi-vector foreign policy, something that the current president of Kazakhstan, a notion that he developed when he was foreign minister, is let's have a relationship with everybody, particularly the United States and the West. And this is why they're very much interested in seeking Western investments into their countries. And quite frankly, if you're one of those countries, we keep talking about democratization in this country. What we just don't understand is that the Russians don't offer a model for political economic governance to the Central Asian states. The Chinese don't offer that. We're the only ones who have a model. And guess what? They're trying to, borrow from the Western experience, of course, in keeping with their own realities. Jen and I were talking about reforms in Uzbekistan. We can't call it democracy, but it's still something that is happening. So, in other words, if we continue to focus here, we're fighting sort of yesterday's wars. Still in sort of World War II Japan mode, Pearl Harbor and all that. And of course, the Cold War. But not to say that you should reduce emphasis here, but there should be, if you will, proportionality. Policy shifts should fill gaps. Not go back to the old toolkit and say, oh, we need to do more of this, more of the same. More of the same isn't going to help. In my view, it could become overkill. And therefore, I think that to examine how China is playing on land, particularly in Central Asia, is going to be hugely important. We think that, oh, we're withdrawn from Afghanistan, that was yesterday's war, the whole thing, we're done with it. That's very short-sighted on the part of Washington. I hope that answers the question.
I have a couple of observations and probably a question. Number one, on Russian weakness. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, I was in DC and many pundits back then predicted that there will be coup, there will be Russia's fragmentation, and so on and so forth. None of those happened. Most of those analyses were exaggerations of Russia's weakness. And of course, it's an authoritarian regime. It's very hard to predict. Part of that is because we don't have access to what's going on in Moscow. Russia's war with Ukraine didn't go well with the West also. Part of it was because we didn't know Russia's. We couldn't capture Kyiv, yes, but Ukraine paid a high price for it. Second observation is that part of this turbulence that you turn in Eurasia is because of the system issue. We're moving towards a multipolar world, and that's by nature a destabilized system. During the Cold War, we had many small wars here and there, which were proxies, but now we have great power conflicts, great power confrontations with Russia fighting in Ukraine. And that will continue till the time I think we settle with this some sort of equilibrium. The third observation I have is that I think there is a convergence of interest between Russians, Indians, and the US and in parts of Central Eurasia when it comes to connectivity. With sanctions and on Russia and Ukraine, Russians are much more interested to connect now with Indians, and that is happening through their international north-south corridor. Russia proposed this back, I think, in 2016, but now they have taken it back. And that they want to come through Iranians to Bombay. They are already, well, who will finance this? That is a problem. And there are also issues related to Georgia, which is not an ally of Russia in that case. But that's one. And second, Russia is also trying to connect along the Central Asia towards Pakistan and India, exporting gas. Kazakhs were interested. Last year, the trade between Kazakhs and the Taliban were close to $1 billion. That's huge. And Russians are also interested. This was what Americans were interested during the Clinton's state secretary. They want South Central Asia, trying to connect these two regions together. And still, our primary interest for Americans is to take Central Asians out of the Russians orbit, and that's happening only one way: to connect it through Trans-Caspian gas pipeline to Europe, and to connect it to Pakistan and India to north, south, to whatever you call it is called. So somehow there is a convergence of interest. Though most of the people assume that Americans and Russians have different interests in Central Asia. Of course, the ultimate goal is different, but the truth that they devise comes to the same outcome. And then I wanted to ask you about what's happening in Syria. Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham is somehow very close to Taliban, what they do and how they portray themselves. It's like a different version of Taliban. And they say, well, we are fighting ISIS, we are fighting Al-Qaeda. That's what Taliban are also saying. And Americans are worried about what's happening in Syria. Now with the sanctions, do you think that in the close future, they will be treated the same as Taliban if they have expanded their stronghold beyond Aleppo, and because Russians are not quite easy and they cannot defend that. There are also reports that Russians are evacuating some of their troops to the base. So if that we have another jihadist group which is not as radical as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but somehow internally busy with whatever they are doing and saying we are respecting you guys in Iraq, we are respecting you guys in Turkey, so we don't have any problems with you as far as you do not send your militias here. So how that will change the entire geopolitical scenario and in the Middle East, because you will have these two identical Islamist groups in Afghanistan and Syria.
That's a great compare and contrast you did between Taliban in Afghanistan and HTS in Syria. I actually wrote about this many years ago. At the time, people weren't convinced that this was the case. So but now we're increasingly having these observations. But let me go back, before I get to Syria, let me go address your 3 points. So I'm with you that there was an entire lobby that says that oh, you know, Russia. First, that lobby was terrified that it's about to invade, and Ukraine will fall. When Ukraine didn't fall, the narrative started to shift, or the faction within that lobby started to say, oh, this is the beginning of the end of the Russian Federation, at least Putin. And you have those, people who say those things. They're not accurate, and I mean they get a disproportionate amount of airtime because these, this sort of the logic of the media. If you're saying something logical, will get airtime, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it doesn't prove to be true. So I'm not saying that Russia is about to crumble or Putin. I'm just saying Putin is, in his 24th year of rule. Anybody who's been ruling for 24 years. And bear in mind that he came to power with the promise that he will, make Russia great again, and revive the power. Keep in mind, Putin never was a adherent of communism. He has no interest in communism, the ideology. But he does long for the Soviet Union as an imperial project. For a person like that to lose Ukraine, which is the most important piece of geopolitical real estate for the Russians, is devastating. And so he has to show that, my rule did not lead to Russia weakening, I made Russia stronger. I'm saying that subjective preferences matter very little. Objective reality, objective geopolitical forces, personal forces, really shape events. And so, he's aging, who will take over. That be a smooth transition, will not be. If Russia is weakening, think about it, they have had to, if you are now relying on North Korea and Iran for weapons and for soldiers, then things are pretty bad. All things being equal, you wouldn't do this. If you had to go kill your own, meaning the head of the Wagner group, then, that doesn't show that things are all good. If you're not able to protect Assad, who, is your only sort of base in the Middle East, then that shows that things are pretty bad. How bad? What will it look like? It's hard to tell. But I have to assume, as an analyst, that this is on the minds of the Russian strategists, that they don't want to lose more areas. Notice that when this was weeks before, like 3 weeks maybe, before the invasion of Ukraine, there was an uprising in Kazakhstan. And the Kazakhs asked for CSTO help, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which they're a member of, led by Russia. And CSTO troops, not all of them Russian, but a majority of them, 2,500 to 3,000 troops, were there for about a week. If you know anything about deployment and pull out, it takes a couple of days to deploy, it takes a couple of days to pull out, which means you were on the ground for a few days. And by all accounts, they were guarding key facilities while it was Kazakh forces that were putting down the unrest in the country. Why am I talking about that? Is that if you're preparing to invade on February 24th, Ukraine, and this thing happens in your strategic backyard, you're worried. We want to focus towards Europe, but we have problems on the rear flank. And if you are one of those who thinks that all uprisings are engineered by the CIA, it's a color revolution, which is something that the Chinese also fear, and they share that with the Russians, then it's a pretty bad situation. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying it'll collapse tomorrow, but these are not promising trends. That's where I stand. As for the corridors, the international north-south transportation corridor, which, by the way, should run somewhere from here through Azerbaijan, and there's a line that should come through the Caspian, through Iran, and off to Mumbai. Again, you mentioned it. Who's going to pay for it? We have a problem. The West is having a problem building the middle corridor, because if you go to oil companies, and you tell them, and energy companies, including natural gas, you tell them Turkmenistan has a lot of natural gas that you could benefit from, the world could benefit from. And they say, well, what is the cost of doing business? We make a profit. So if the West is not so eager to jump in because of, again, logistical constraints, so constraints having to do with supply chain and resources, then I'm not sure a sanctioned Russia that's losing in Ukraine is going to be able to build this. Iran is sanctioned. The Indians would love to do this business. Indians have built Chabahar to the point where they can. They built that road in Afghanistan that was connecting, it runs from Zaranj to Delaram. That was connecting Chabahar, which is right here, to the ring road that connects Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, Mazar. And so they've done that, but they're not about to annoy the United States to go and do business with, the Russians or the Iranians. So there are constraints, what I'm trying to say. We can have all these plans, but there are basically constraints. I hope I've addressed your questions. Yes.
I have a similar question to Ed's other question, which should correspond with the nationalisms. Earlier you used the metaphor of, Ukraine being a province to the east of Russian lines. But if you look at this map, geography here, Indo-Pacific strategy looks at the West Pacific because this place is Japan, Korea, very advanced OECD economies. But then you have in economies like Indonesia, Vietnam, India, even Bangladesh projected double-digit growth if you can run it.
You can add Asia to the list.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that in this region, economic is really growing. It's amazing. Because historically, U.S. colony for a few decades. MacArthur used Japan for 6 years. You have all this deep engagement with these countries. You have a deep familiarity. We look at a part of Eurasia, on Ireland, and even in the city, quite distant from the knowledge that we have about peoples and cultures. So I wonder if the strategy here is really looking at the economy and also the area of dealing with those countries, rather than doing some unfamiliar territory, which is very contentious to begin with. And then, even when we look at China's strategy in Central Asia, some people actually count out is that going to bring a lot of benefits of that into the liability, big security risk and economically, they are not that strong in that region. So that's
No, it's a great question, great observation. I agree with you that it's not just when I said familiar toolkit, it's also familiar terrain and the economic incentive there that you pointed out. We've done business with both. This is a familiar way of doing stuff, and that's what you reach for as strategists and policymakers. Is if there's a problem, then you say, okay, how do we solve this? And there's institutional memory within the State Department, within the intelligence community, within the Defense Department, within USAID and other branches that sort of says, okay, this is what we did before, so let's do it that way. Creativity isn't something that you can expect from strategists, and that's why it's strategy, long-term thinking. There is a department at Pentagon called the Office of Net Assessments. The Office of Net Assessments was established by the Nixon administration, particularly by Henry Kissinger. They invited somebody by the name of Andrew Marshall. Andrew Marshall ran ONA, Office of Net Assessments, for 42 years. That was the only department that I am familiar with that went to the extent of doing long-range forecasts and planning. And it was because they were absolved of having to do the day-to-day, the reactive stuff. So I think that there's a bigger question embedded in your in the point that you raised, is how the U.S. has dealt with the world traditionally and how the world is changing. The United States institutions are somewhere between 70 to 80 years old. Everything that we are familiar with, the Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency, and all this entire apparatus, we can get going to other branches of the U.S. government, and you'll find the same thing. They were built before, during, and after World War II. They were great in terms of winning that conflict and dealing with the Cold War. But this is a different world now. And I think that especially now, the last 30 years, it has been phenomenally challenging with the rise of technology. I was reading somewhere that the amount of information that is publicly available since the advent of the internet, say, circa 1981, if we use that as a cutoff date, is way more than what humanity produced prior to that. So what you have is the amount of available information, the volume, is something that I would say the human brain was not designed to process, which is why you have these cultural wars, which is why people are drowning in information overload. I remember a time where there was the daily newspaper, the evening news on television, and if you wanted more, you could probably get a subscription to Time Magazine, Newsweek, and if you still wanted more, you had to go to a library. Now it's everything is on this, and the iPad and its cousins and whatnot, and people just don't know what to do with that information. As an analyst, I can tell you, as a professional analyst whose business it is to deal with inordinate amounts of information, I'm drowning. I can't make sense of it. And in the last 5-6 years, we now have AI. So this is a different world. That has to be factored in how the United States approaches things. And using the same old toolkits isn't going to get the United States further. But yes, there is economic incentive. Your points you made are absolutely valid. I'm talking about tools, how you approach those problems, how you conceptualize them. It requires a rethink, an overhaul of the way the federal government of the United States has, operated for 70, 80 years. Because if you just look at the bureaucracy, I can tell you that the State Department, you have computers that most people would not buy from a shop. So, that's a big problem. And so there is a need to overhaul. And this is something that this is natural. I mean, it's something that is part of the history of the United States. If you look at the system that when the Republic was founded, it was founded on the pretext, but there was a problem at the time, getting all the colonies and states to become part of the Union. The compromise was weak federal government, strong states. That worked well, got the country together, but it led to the Civil War. And the Civil War had to be addressed through Reconstruction, which is when the federal government became stronger. Another 7-8 decades later, you have the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, the solution for that was that the federal government should not just be more stronger than the states, it should also regulate the economy and society. So now you have, everything from FDR onwards, you have a hyper-technocratic state. But its abilities to deal with the new problems of the world are, mounting its challenges. How many times do you call a 1-800 number, and you are being told to go from one person to another? You don't get I'm not talking about government bureaucracy, I'm not talking about calling Walmart or Amazon. If you have to deal with the IRS, if you have to deal with immigration, if you have to deal with Department of Health, or whatever it is you have to deal with, you're just being given the runaround because the system is old, it needs renovation. So I think that's sort of something that needs to be overlaid in terms of how we approach this puzzle called Eurasian. Yes.
A quick question about BRI and the role of China and Eurasia. Do you think that there's a response of failed project, why it's so slow, and how it can shape the future of Eurasia?
Yeah, I mean, that's another good question. So there is a problem that in the Chinese strategy and how it sort of approaches. The Chinese are very comfortable in going to countries that I would call malleable. Not very strong, but not very weak, where they can do business. The way they do business, they go in Because if you have a strong government, there's pushback. So for example, Kazakhstan is now pushing back against this whole China BRI thing, saying, okay, you know, this is great, we want parts of it, but there are parts of it we don't want. Contrast that with Uzbekistan that has, you know, is more welcoming because of its own circumstances. If the Chinese generally go into areas of Africa, Sri Lanka, look at Myanmar, look at Pakistan. Pakistan is sort of the signature, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the signature project of the BRI. They've spent so much money in that they've not spent anywhere else. The allocation was 62, and I think they paid 45. The country's debt has doubled because of that. So Sri Lanka has defaulted. You know, Myanmar is now falling apart. At least 5 rebel groups that I have heard of that control territory, which amounts to about half the country, on the borders of Thailand, Bangladesh, China, and even India. So the model of doing business is what the Chinese have a problem with. You go in, you put money in, it doesn't strengthen the state, it actually weakens it further. And that is the problem. It's in the model, it's in the business model of the Chinese, which is why BRI, and when did BRI launch? 5 years, 4 years after the global financial crisis, 08, 09. That was a huge hit for China, the financial crisis, because China basically established itself as the industrial plant of the world, which means that we'll produce everything for you. And it assumes that people will buy your goods. Well, if the world goes into recession, demand goes down. And the social contract of the Chinese Communist Party with its people is, we will provide you with prosperity. That's why you should support and not, you shouldn't oppose the Chinese Communist Party, because look what we've done. It worked well until the financial crisis. When those double-digit growth rates or the high single-digit growth rates are no more, then you have a hard time essentially fulfilling that social contract of near full employment. BRI was flawed to begin with. So what is it? Is it money being given to countries? Not really. The money is coming from Chinese to Chinese companies who are employing Chinese workers. It was a way around that problem of declining global demand for Chinese goods. Now the situation is even worse. So if you are looking at your biggest BRI project and you've sunk $40+ billion and that country is falling apart, and you're telling Pakistan that, well, you can't protect our workers, they're being killed by the Baloch or the Taliban, how about we send some PLA troops? Something that Chinese have never done. And now this
military, Chinese militaries are in Pakistan.
they are, and they're negotiating for now saying, okay, you're sensitive about people in uniform with PLA. How about we bring you private military company? Okay. Now this is the pressure. The Pakistanis can only sort of push back so much because they rely on them to keep, rolling over the loans. So at some point now, makes India nervous because India is saying, you're strategically poking us here on our Himalayan border, and if you come here, then you're on our western flank as well. So that's another potential crisis in the making. So this is what I mean by that sort of strategic churn. And yes, I mean, the Chinese have their challenges. I guess in sort of the larger scheme of things, this is part of their efforts to become a big power. This is the cost of doing business. These are unintended consequences of trying to do your own model.
Listen, but before that, I would like to say, yeah, I completely agree in terms of BRI in how China playing that the countries that they have fully control of that policy. If even Afghanistan, in case of Afghanistan, Taliban is like so actively inviting China to involve Afghanistan in BRI, but China is so conscious because they have no control of the security of Afghanistan. But if you come back to the South China Sea and the fact that the US policy, which is like much more focusing on the east part of China, do you think it's just because, you know, if you see the Chinese economic dynamic is like 70% of almost around 70% of Chinese economy GDP is coming from the
coastal areas.
yes, and this is like China is like historically that's the land that Chinese developed itself. If you came to West, you know, China somehow built up some buffer zone. First, it is like Xinjiang and Tibet, and even they're going to go more further. Right now, they're focusing in Tajikistan to make it a buffer zone between any force in China. So, and then if you go to like lands from Central Asia to China, which is like the base of them is like that, you're gonna through a lot of buffers, go through a lot of buffers. But if you move from sea, which is the like South China Sea, is you directly reach the core of their economy. Do you think is that the reason why US is focused there?
I think it's connected, but I think it's the reverse. The coastal areas hug a maritime space, the South China Sea and the broader Western Pacific seaboard, where the US is the dominant power with its alliance structure. The Chinese naturally have to break out. Not today, not tomorrow. This is a multi-decade process. I don't know if you guys have been following on, but the Chinese Navy has been doing exercises from the South China Sea around Taiwan, going into the Sea of Japan, and even close to Alaska, the Aleutian Islands. Along with they're doing it jointly with Russia. Nothing very sophisticated, nothing alarming, but they're doing that. Why? Because they remember how Japan and the United States went to war because Japan was so dependent on imports of raw material. And they thought, the Japanese thought, that the Americans were going to strangle them in the context of World War II. And they had to, before the US became a dominant power in the Pacific, the Japanese had to push out. Chinese know they have to do that similarly, because otherwise they're going to completely be blocked in the military sense and the commercial sense. But they also remember what happened to Japan. It lost the war. And so they don't want to repeat those same mistakes, which is why I think that we shouldn't read too much into this conquest of Taiwan thing, because it's very hard. It's too pricey. And what are you going to get? I think that the Chinese, if the Chinese get Taiwan, it will be like that cherry on the top of the cake. The very last thing they would do if they become a big power in a scenario like that. But in the here and now, they have far more bigger problems to deal with. So I think that they are the ones pushing out, which is what the US is reacting to. And again, goes back to the whole familiar toolkit. Everything is a problem in space. While we leave holes and then we say, okay, so, I mean, just look at what the Biden administration did. They said, they were told, hey, look, what are you doing about the BRI? And they said, well, we'll build our own, call it PGII. So why are you reinventing the wheel? They've already done it. And so it's hard for bureaucracies and governments to think creatively. This is the job of this is also something that needs to be sort of realigned in the epistemic community, especially those who deal with policy. That how do we look at these things? You know, we're using the old lenses and continuing to look at the world as it was once. And where we were, in other words, we need to be pushed out of our comfort zones to look at things differently. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thanks. You're almost there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kamran, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.